You want to know what failure looks like? Take a good long look at the back of the room. Brandon Cole said it into the microphone at the company's 40th anniversary gala, pointing his champagne flute at the old black man quietly changing a trash liner against the far wall. 20 years that man's pushed a mop in this building. Same job, same wall, same trash. Let him be a lesson to the young people here tonight. That's where you end up when you don't apply yourself. A few hundred employees gave the small, uncomfortable laugh of people just relieved it isn't them. The ballroom glittered, chandeliers, an open bar, a 20-foot logo glowing behind the stage. Into that room, as into every room for 20 years, Eddie Turner had come quietly with his cart to do the unglamorous work that let important people feel important. Emptying the bins they filled, keeping the machine clean so no one ever had to think about it. He hadn't expected to be noticed tonight any more than any other night. That was the cruelty of it. Brandon reached into the one corner of the room everyone had agreed not to look at, and dragged the invisible man into the spotlight, not to see him, but to use him. Eddie kept working, tied off the bag, dropped in a fresh liner, let the laughter roll off his back. A man invisible for 2 decades doesn't flinch when someone finally points at him. What Brandon didn't know, what no one holding a glass in that ballroom knew, was that the old janitor they were laughing at had spent those 20 years on a paycheck that barely covered a rented room, secretly putting other people's children through college, that the worn green notebook in his shirt pocket held 40 names, and that a good number of those names were sitting in that very ballroom right now, in expensive suits, laughing along with everybody else, including the man at the microphone. Before this room finds out whose name is really in the old man's notebook, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive back into the story. His name was Eddie Turner, and he was 63 years old, and he had been the night custodian at Halverson Reed for 2 decades. To the people who worked there, he was less a person than a fixture, like the elevators or the light switches or the hum of the air handlers, something that kept the place running and that you never actually looked at. They handed him their trash without breaking conversation. They talked about their raises and their affairs and their divorces 3 feet from him, as though he were a coat rack that happened to be standing there. In 20 years, the number of executives who had bothered to learn his name, you could count on one hand and still have fingers left over. 20 years is a long time to be furniture. Eddie had started at Halverson Reed when half the people at this gala were in high school. And in all that time, the building had changed around him. New logos, new leadership, 3 remodels, a whole turnover of faces. While Eddie stayed, the one constant. The man who knew where the shut-off valves were and which window leaked in a hard rain, and how to coax the freight elevator when it stuck between 4 and 5. He had buffed the lobby floor so many times he could have done it blind. He had cleaned up after holiday parties and product launches and the quiet private disasters of 1,000 ordinary nights. He had been, without anyone noticing, part of the bones of the place. And in all those years, the small daily erasures had simply become the weather of his life. Executives stepped into the elevator he was cleaning and kept talking as though it were empty. People set their coffee cups directly on his cart without a word, the way you'd set something on a shelf. New hires were told, on their first day, where the bathrooms were and where the printer was, and never once told the name of the man who would empty their trash every night for years. Eddie had long ago stopped expecting otherwise. He did not let it make him bitter. Bitterness was a luxury, and Eddie did not buy luxuries. He simply did his work and watched and saw the things the scene people were too important to see. But Eddie saw all of them. That was the thing none of them ever understood about a man who cleans a building at night. He comes to know it far better than the people who think they own it. He knew which conference room the leadership team did their real fighting in, with the door shut. He knew which young analyst cried in the 3rd-floor stairwell at 9 at night over a job that was quietly eating her alive. He knew which junior hire stayed until midnight, not out of ambition, but out of terror, because he'd come from nothing and could not afford, could not survive, the shame of failing. Eddie knew the whole secret human weather of that building, the strivers and the strugglers and the ones hanging on by their fingernails, because Eddie Turner had come from nothing himself, and he recognized his own kind on sight every time. He knew, for instance, about the young woman in accounting who ate vending machine crackers for dinner most nights because she was wiring half of every paycheck home to a mother 2 states away who was sick and getting sicker. He had read the entire arithmetic of her life in the careful way she rationed those crackers, and some nights he left a small gift card to the deli downstairs on her keyboard, unsigned because a person should eat. He knew about the mailroom kid, 18, sharp as a fresh blade, who propped a community college textbook against the sorting table on his breaks and did the reading standing up. He knew which executives were kind to the cleaning crew when nobody was watching, and which were only ever kind when somebody was. A janitor at night sees a building with its mask off. People are certain no one is watching at 2 a.m. Eddie was always watching. His own life was as small and bare as a life can get. The single rented room he went home to held a narrow bed, 1 chair, a hot plate, and a shelf of library books, and almost nothing else, because almost nothing else was where his money went. He owned 1 good coat. He ate the same rotation of cheap meals, beans and rice, oatmeal, a big pot of soup made on Sundays to stretch across the week, and his one indulgence in all the world was a diner breakfast on the first Sunday of every month, eggs and bacon and bottomless coffee, where the waitress knew his order by heart and called him by his name, which was more than almost anyone where he worked had done in 20 years. He wore his work boots until the soles split, and then he had them re-soled because new boots were $30, and $30 to Eddie was somebody's textbook. There was a ritual to his weeks, spare and private. Saturdays he did the wash at the laundromat on the corner and read at the library until it closed. Sundays he made the big pot of soup that would carry him through to the next Sunday, and then, the first Sunday of the month, he allowed himself the one indulgence, the diner 2 blocks down, the corner booth, eggs and bacon and bottomless coffee, and the waitress, a woman named Rosa, who had worked there as long as Eddie had cleaned the tower, who knew his order and called him Mr. Turner and asked after his health. That hour, once a month, was the only place in Eddie's life where he was a person with a name to someone who wasn't asking him for anything. He treasured it more than he would ever have admitted, and at the end of every month, at the little table in his rented room under the one good lamp, he did his accounts. Not the way most people do accounts. He took out the green notebook and he updated it. A few dollars added here to the running total, a deposit log there, and, on the good months, a new name written in his careful block print, with the amount beside it, and a small private prayer said over it that he would never have called a prayer. He tracked the old names, too, the ones from years back, scanning the local news and the alumni notices and the chance mentions for word of how his planted seeds were growing. Nurse, teacher, engineer. He would add the note beside the name, mate it, and sit with it for a moment, and feel for that moment, something that was almost, not quite, but almost like the thing other men feel looking at photographs of their grandchildren. The few people who ever glimpsed how Eddie lived assumed it was simply that a janitor's wage left nothing over. They were wrong. There was plenty left over. There was, in fact, a great deal left over, scraped and hoarded and saved with a discipline that bordered on the religious. It just never went to Eddie. For 20 years, every spare dollar Eddie Turner could wring out of a janitor's life had been going somewhere else, somewhere secret, somewhere that would have stopped every soul in that ballroom cold if they had known. He lived like a man with nothing, because he was, deliberately and quietly, giving everything away. And he carried it always in the breast pocket of his gray work shirt, a small green notebook, soft and furred at the corners from 20 years of handling, the cover worn pale where his thumb had rested 10,000 times. Inside, in his careful block printing, was a list of names. Beside each name, a number, and beside many of the names, a second note added later, in different ink on some different day. A job, a title, a city, a life. If the people in that ballroom had thought about the old man's notebook at all, they would have assumed it held cleaning schedules, supply orders, the small, forgettable concerns of a small, forgettable life. They could not possibly have been more wrong about what was in that book, or about the man who carried it. And in a little under an hour, every last person in that room was going to find out. To understand why this night lands the way it does, why it comes down like a hammer, you have to understand the man at the microphone. Because Brandon Cole's story and Eddie Turner's story are, underneath all of it, the very same story. Brandon just doesn't know that yet. Brandon was 34, the youngest vice president in the company's history, and he wore the title like armor bolted directly onto his skin. He was sharp and charming when charm was useful to him, and quietly merciless to anyone beneath him, which is a particular flavor of cruelty you mostly find in people who clawed their way out of somewhere they are deeply ashamed of. Because Brandon Cole had not been born into the suit he was wearing tonight. He had come up from a hard place, a poor town, a poorer house, the kind of childhood the people sipping champagne around him could not have imagined and would not have wanted to. He had dragged himself up out of it by his fingernails, and somewhere in the dragging he had struck a quiet, ugly bargain with himself about how the world worked, that it split cleanly into winners and losers, that he had made himself a winner through sheer force of will, and that the losers, the moppers, the strugglers, the people still stuck where he had started, had simply failed to want it badly enough. It made him hate, a little, the very thing he had once been. A man like Brandon looks at an old janitor and does not see a person. He sees the ghost of the life he escaped, reaching up out of the floor for his ankle, and he needs to stamp on it, publicly, to prove to himself one more time just how far he has climbed. You could see it in the small ways he ran his floor. Brandon remembered the name of everyone above him, and could not be bothered with a single name below. He had walked past the same security guard every morning for 2 years, and never once said good morning. He had cut the holiday bonuses for the support staff in his very first quarter, and bragged about the savings in a leadership meeting. He held a special contempt for anyone who had stayed a long time in a humble job, as though endurance were a moral failing, rather than, very often, a quiet and unglamorous form of dignity. 20 years pushing a mop, to Brandon Cole, was not perseverance. It was proof of a man who had simply never wanted more. The people who worked under Brandon traded survival tips about him, the way sailors trade tips about a dangerous coast. Don't bring him a problem without 3 solutions. Don't be the slowest one in the room. Don't ever, ever let him catch you looking like you're coasting. There was a story everyone on the floor knew, about a long-serving administrative assistant, a woman 2 years from retirement who had given the company 25 years, whom Brandon had reorganized out of a job in a single afternoon to save a line on a budget, and how he had described it afterward to laughter as trimming the dead weight. That was the phrase he used about human beings, dead weight. He had built a whole philosophy out of the idea that the world owed nothing to anyone who hadn't clawed their way up the way he had, and he enforced that philosophy on everyone beneath him with a cold efficiency that the people above him mistook for leadership. And the cruelest joke of it, the one the universe was about to spring on him in front of 400 people, was that Brandon Cole was not a self-made man at all. He was, exactly like the strugglers he despised, a person who had been one bad break away from going under, and had been saved at the last possible moment by a stranger's quiet mercy. He had simply spent 15 years burying that fact so deep that he'd come to believe his own myth. He punished in others the very thing that had saved him, because acknowledging it in them would have meant acknowledging it in himself. There is no one crueler to the drowning than a man who is secretly terrified he is still wet. And underneath the cruelty, as there always is, there was fear. Brandon was not afraid of failing exactly. He was afraid of falling back, of being again the poor kid in the wrong shoes that the other children could smell the lack on from clear across the lunchroom. He had built an entire self out of forward motion, and any reminder of where he had come from felt like a hand closing around his ankle to drag him back down into it. So he kept the distance cruel. He could not be kind to the people he had come from, because kindness would have meant admitting he was still one of them underneath the tailoring. And that admission was the single thing his whole identity existed to prevent. The harder a person had it, the more Brandon needed to look down on them, because looking down was the only way he knew to keep himself from looking back. What Brandon Cole had buried so deep that he had nearly convinced himself of his own version of events was this: he had not actually done it alone. There had been a single hinge moment at 18, when he had the grades but not a dollar to his name, when college was sliding out of reach and the whole rest of his life was about to fork down the bad road for good. And an envelope had arrived. A scholarship, anonymous. Enough to change absolutely everything. No name on it, no strings attached, nobody to thank. Over the years, Brandon had told himself that he'd earned it, that it didn't really matter where it came from. And eventually, he had simply stopped thinking about it at all, because it was so much easier to believe that he was self-made. Self-made men don't owe anyone anything. Self-made men get to look down on whoever they please. He had never once in 15 years let himself wonder who had sent that envelope, and he had spent the last decade walking past the answer every single night and handing him his trash. If he had let himself remember it, really remember it, instead of folding it away, he'd have remembered standing at the mailbox at 18 with the thing in his hands, reading it 3 times because it didn't make sense, because people like him did not get letters like this. He'd have remembered his mother crying at the kitchen table, the same table where the eviction notices usually landed, holding the letter like it might evaporate. He'd have remembered the specific dizzy, almost violent feeling of a door swinging open where, the day before, there had only been a wall, the feeling that the rest of his life had just been handed back to him by a stranger who wanted nothing, not even to be known. He had felt, for one night, the purest gratitude a young man can feel. And then he had spent 15 years killing that feeling, because gratitude is inconvenient to a self-made man. Gratitude means you owe. Gratitude means somebody else's hand is on your success, and Brandon needed both hands on it to be his own. So, he had quietly rewritten the story until the envelope was a footnote, then a coincidence, then nothing, until he genuinely believed he had clawed up out of that poor town on his will alone, and could therefore look down on everyone who hadn't as simply weaker than he was. The envelope had saved his life, and he had repaid it by becoming a man who would have sneered at the kind of person who sends one. That was the quiet tragedy sitting under his expensive suit, and he had no idea, none at all, that the hand that signed his second chance was in the same room, holding a mop. Here is the secret Eddie Turner had been keeping for 20 years, the secret that made him, by a mile, the richest poor man in that entire building. On a janitor's wage, a wage that meant the single rented room, a bus pass instead of a car, the boots resoled until the leather finally gave out, the one restaurant meal a month as his whole allowance of luxury in this life. Eddie had been quietly putting strangers' children through school. Not one of them. Not 2. 40. Over 20 years. 40 young people who had the grades and the hunger and everything it takes to make something of themselves except the money. Kids who were one closed door away from falling clean through the cracks in the floor had received an envelope they could not explain. Tuition covered. A scholarship from a small foundation with a bland, forgettable name, and not one human face attached to it anywhere. No one to thank. No strings. Just a door, held open by a hand they never saw and never would. He had set it up carefully, years before, with the help of a young legal aid lawyer he had once quietly helped himself, a small, real, properly registered fund, fed almost entirely by a custodian making careful cash deposits and money orders, a handful of dollars at a time for 2 solid decades. He chose the recipients himself, watching for them the way a man watches the weather. The teenager bagging groceries with a textbook open on the bagging counter. The kid at the community center who lit up like a struck match over a math problem. The strivers in his own building's mailroom. He almost never met any of them as their benefactor. He would simply watch from behind a mop as the envelope landed and a whole life changed direction. And then he would write the name in the green notebook and the amount beside it, and later, as he tracked them quietly over the years, the way a gardener checks on what he has planted, the rest. Nurse, teacher, engineer, got out, made it, 40 names. A nurse who now ran a hospital's intensive care unit. A school teacher in the very neighborhood Eddie himself had grown up hungry in. 2 brothers who had opened a garage together. Lawyers, coders, a city councilwoman, a social worker, a man who built bridges. An entire constellation of lives lifted up out of the dark by a man who ate 1 restaurant meal a month so that other people's children would not have to drown. And not one of those 40 had ever seen his face or learned his name. And he had chosen every one of them himself, the way a man who knows exactly what a single open door is worth chooses where to spend the little he has. Take the young man in the parking garage, because that one tells you everything about Eddie Turner. It was a hard February, and Eddie had noticed a car on the 3rd level that never moved. Same spot, dawn after dawn, windows fogged from the inside. He could have reported it. Most people would have, because a car somebody is living in is a problem, a liability, not your business. Eddie didn't report it. He watched the way he watched everything, and he saw the young man slip out before the building filled each morning. In a wrinkled shirt, he was clearly trying to keep nice, and Eddie understood at once. A kid with a job in the building and nowhere to live, too proud or too scared to tell a soul. Sleeping in his car in the cold so he could keep showing up to work and keep clawing towards something better. Eddie never said a word to him about it, not one. He understood that the worst thing you can do to a proud person at the bottom is let them know you have seen them there. So instead he left things. A thermos of his Sunday soup, still warm, on the stairwell ledge by the 3rd level, where the young man would find it and where Eddie would never be. A spare blanket from his own bare room, folded on the car's hood one brutal night. Hand warmers from the dollar store, never a note, never a word. Just small warm proof, arriving from nowhere, that the universe had not entirely forgotten there was a person freezing on the 3rd floor of a parking garage. And then, when Eddie had quietly learned enough, the kid's name, that he was trying to finish a degree at night, that a single semester's tuition stood between him and a real job with a real apartment with a door that locked, an envelope arrived. Anonymous. Enough. The young man wept in his fogged-up car when he opened it, and he never knew who sent it, and that was exactly how Eddie wanted it. There was the girl who used to do her homework in the building's lobby, night after night, because the shelter she and her mother stayed in had no good light to read by. Eddie used to leave the brightest lamp at his station on for her, and find slow, careful reasons to mop nearby, so that a 12-year-old doing long division on a marble floor at 9 at night would not have to feel quite so alone in the world. He watched her grow up over the years, the way you watch a plant you've quietly been watering. She is in a pharmacy program now. She still does not know that the old man with the mop was the reason the light was always on. There was the single father in the mailroom with 3 kids and a community college dream he had folded up and put away because there was simply no room in his life for it. The dream came back out of the drawer the week an envelope arrived. There was the cafeteria worker's son, and the security guard's niece, and the kid Eddie only ever saw at the bus stop with a library book too advanced for his grade. 40 of them. 40 cold Februaries, one way or another. 40 proud, frightened, brilliant kids who got warm soup from nowhere and an envelope from no one, and went on to build lives they believed, every one of them, that they had built alone. Eddie let them all believe exactly that, because a gift with a face on it becomes a debt, And Eddie did not want any of them walking around feeling they owed him a thing. He wanted them walking around free. So he carried the cost himself, the going without, the secrecy, the 20 years of one rented room and one restaurant meal a month, and he counted it every single day as the best bargain he had ever made in his life, because each envelope was a door held open at the exact fork where he had lost his own boy. And if he could not save the one child he would have given the whole world for, then by God he would save somebody else's 40 times over, and let that be the meaning of a life the world had decided did not have any. Why would a man do that? Why would anyone give away the whole of a life's wages in secret, expecting nothing in return, not so much as a single thank you, because of the one name in the green notebook that had no happy note written beside it, the first name, the name at the very top of the list, the name the whole list was really for, his son's. Maurice Turner had been a good boy with a quick mind and a wide-open smile, and Eddie had raised him alone after Maurice's mother passed on that same janitor's wage in those same small rented rooms. And Maurice had the grades. That was the thing that would haunt Eddie for the rest of his life. The boy had the grades. He had a place waiting for him at the state school and a future you could see coming from a mile off, the kind of future that was supposed to lift them both up out of the hole they'd been born into. What Maurice did not have was the money. And back then, Eddie did not have it either, not nearly enough. And the scholarships fell through, and the loan applications came back, stamped with that one flat word, no. And the single open door in front of his bright boy swung quietly, bureaucratically, shut. And Eddie watched what happens to a young man when the one door in front of him closes and there is no other one in sight. Maurice stayed. He drifted. The friends changed, and then the boy himself began to change, and the wide-open smile went somewhere Eddie could not follow it. Down the hard road that a poor neighborhood always keeps open for its young men, once every better road has been bolted shut. Eddie tried everything a father can possibly try. It was not enough. He lost him. Maurice was gone before he turned 21, lost to the streets in the bad years. A life that should have been a teacher's or a nurse's or anything at all, ended before it had even been given the chance to begin. Eddie remembered the day the last door closed with a clarity that never faded, not in 20 years. He remembered the kitchen table and the loan letter, and the way Maurice had read it twice and then set it down very gently, the way you set down something you've decided not to throw. He remembered his son saying, "It's all right, Pop. It's not a big deal. I'll work a year, save up, go next year." And he remembered knowing, even as the boy said it, that next year was a door that does not stay propped, that a bright kid who steps off the road at 18 to save up gets pulled by the current of a hard neighborhood into 100 things that are not saving up, and that the longer the gap, the heavier the pull. He had known it, and he had not had the money to stop it, and that was the whole helpless horror of being poor with a gifted child. You can see the cliff coming from a mile off, and you cannot afford the few dollars it would take to steer around it. He remembered the slow way he lost the boy after that, not all at once. A bright kid does not go dark overnight. He dims a little at a time as door after door clicks shut, and the only people who seem to have a place for him are the ones standing on the bad road with their hands open. Eddie worked doubles to try to get ahead of it, which meant he was gone exactly when his son needed a father at the table, which is the cruelest math poverty does to a single parent. It forces you to choose between the money your child needs and the presence your child needs, and there is no right answer, and you lose either way. He'd come home at 2 a.m. and stand in the doorway of Morris's empty room and feel the cliff under the whole apartment. And he remembered the night the knock came, the knock every parent in that kind of neighborhood lies awake braced for, and how the world simply ended, quietly, in a hallway, with a stranger's careful voice and a clipboard. The boy who called at 6 o'clock on the dot when he was small. The boy with the wide-open smile and the acceptance letter and the future you could see from a mile off. Gone before he was old enough to legally buy a beer, for the want of a sum of money that the people laughing in that ballroom spent on dinner without a second thought. Eddie buried his son with the boy's college acceptance letter folded into the casket because it was the truest thing he had to send with him, proof of who Maurice could have been if only a few $1,000s had landed in the right hand at the right moment. For a long time after, Eddie was not really a person at all. He went to work, and he came home, and he sat in the dark, and the grief was an entire country, and he lived in it alone. He replayed every fork in the road, every single place where a little money might have changed the ending. People told him it was not his fault, and they were right. And it helped nothing whatsoever, because the world had decided his bright boy was not worth a few $1,000s, and his bright boy had finally, fatally believed them. And now the chair where Maurice used to sit was empty forever, and no amount of "it's not your fault" was ever going to fill it. For months he barely spoke. He kept Maurice's room exactly as it was: the unmade bed, the second-hand textbooks the boy had read ahead in for a college he never got to attend, the basketball trophy from a better year. He'd stand in the doorway of that room at the end of his shifts, 3 and 4 in the morning, and he'd feel the size of the silence, the particular silence of a phone that used to ring at 6 o'clock and never would again. People at work, the few who knew, said the kind, useless things people say, and Eddie thanked them and went back to his mop, because the mop, at least, asked nothing of him and let him be invisible while he fell apart, which was the only way Eddie knew how to fall apart, quietly, and where no one would have to watch. And underneath the grief, slowly, a question started to form, the question that would eventually become the rest of his life. It was not why me, or why him. Eddie had grown up too poor and seen too much to expect the world to be fair. The question was simpler and harder. What do I do with this now? He had a son's worth of love and nowhere left to put it. He had a father's whole capacity to provide and no child left to provide for. That kind of love does not evaporate when the person it was for is gone. It sits in you, enormous and homeless, and it will either curdle into bitterness or it will go looking for somewhere new to land. Eddie's went looking. What pulled Eddie up out of that dark, in the end, was not comfort. It was a decision. He understood, with a terrible and total clarity, that there was nothing left he could ever do for Maurice. That door was shut and bolted, and his son was on the far side of it for good. But the world was full of doors exactly like the one that had closed on his boy, full of bright kids with acceptance letters and empty pockets, standing at the very same fork Maurice had stood at, a few $1,000s away from a completely different life. Eddie could not open the door for his own son, but he had 2 strong hands, and a job that nobody on earth would ever begrudge him, and a wage he could cut right down to the bone. He could open the door for somebody else's son, for somebody else's daughter. He could make certain that, somewhere, another father never had to bury an acceptance letter. So, that is exactly what he did. He named the very first scholarship after Maurice, in the paperwork, where no recipient would ever read it. And then, for 20 years, every envelope he sent out was Eddie reaching back through time to the fork where he had lost his boy, and holding the door open this time for a stranger, because a stranger was who he had left to save. 40 times, Eddie Turner reached into the dark and pulled out a child who was not his, because he could not pull out the one who was. And he wrote each of their names underneath Maurice's so that his son would never have to sit alone at the top of that list. That is the man Brandon Cole was pointing at and laughing at from the stage of that gala. A man who had taken the single worst loss a human being can suffer and turned it, in silence, into 40 rescued lives. And Brandon was about to do something a great deal worse than laugh. Because up on that stage, riding the crowd's nervous laughter like a wave he didn't want to come down off of, Brandon decided to make the old janitor a permanent part of his big night. Actually, he said into the microphone, smiling, swirling the champagne in his glass, since we're all here celebrating this company's future tonight, let's take a second to talk about efficiency, about modernizing, streamlining, and I'll be honest with you, Some of the old fixtures around here have just got to go." His eyes slid to the back of the room, to Eddie. "No offense, old-timer. Nothing personal. It's just business. Time to make a little room for people who are actually going somewhere." The room shifted. The laughter died. This had stopped being a cruel joke and curdled into something uglier. A powerful young man firing a 63-year-old custodian for sport in front of the entire company as the evening's entertainment. A few people looked down at their shoes. Nobody said anything. Nobody ever does, in the moment. That is the whole reason men like Brandon get away with it for years. Brandon was enjoying it. That was the worst part of it. He had an audience and a target, and the particular intoxication of power used cruelly. And he leaned all the way into it, the way a man leans into a microphone he believes is his by right. "I mean, let's be honest with each other," he went on, swirling the champagne, performing for the room. "We stand up here every year and we talk about excellence, about being the best, about raising the bar. And then we've got people who have done the literal same task, the same way, for 20 straight years and called it a career. That's not loyalty, folks. Let's stop pretending it's loyalty. That's a simple failure of ambition. And the thing about ambition is that it's contagious." He gestured at Eddie with his glass, the way a man points at a stain on the carpet. "But so is the other thing. So let's clean house a little tonight. Out with the old." A couple of his lieutenants laughed because their bonuses lived and died on Brandon's approval. But the laughter was thinner now, and it died faster. The room could feel the meanness of it. The way a crowd can always feel when a joke has slid past, funny into something they do not want to be part of. People shifted in their seats. A vice president from another division frowned into his drink. And still, this is the part the story wants you to sit inside for one uncomfortable second. Nobody stood up. Nobody said his name. It does not take a room full of villains to crush a good man in public. It only takes one loud, cruel person and a room full of decent people who decide, each one privately, that it is not their place to be the one who speaks. Eddie Turner had survived 100 smaller versions of exactly this, in exactly this room, for 20 years. He knew the whole arithmetic of it by heart. And inside Eddie in that moment, there was not the rage you might expect. There was something quieter and older and much harder to look at. He thought, the way he always did when the world reminded him what it had decided he was, of Maurice. He thought of the green notebook against his chest and the 40 names inside it, and the one name at the very top. And he thought, with no bitterness in it at all, only a bone-deep weariness, this shining, furious young man up there calling me a lesson in failure. I have probably put a boy exactly like him through school, maybe more than one. I have probably held a door open somewhere for a kid who grew up to be just as frightened and just as cruel about it as this one. The thought did not make Eddie angry. It made him certain of the one thing he had always done in the face of cruelty, which was to keep his dignity and refuse, absolutely, to give them the show they were waiting for. But not everyone in that ballroom was comfortable, and one person in particular had gone rigid in her chair. The young woman from accounting, the one who'd wired half her checks home, who had found anonymous deli gift cards on her keyboard on her very hardest weeks and never once known where they came from, was watching the old janitor be humiliated and feeling something twist in her chest that she could not yet name. She didn't know yet. None of them knew yet. But some buried instinct in her was already halfway to its feet, wanting to stand and say, "Stop. That's not right. You don't know him." And the same fear that keeps every decent person frozen in moments exactly like this one kept her in her seat, hating herself a little, telling herself it wasn't her place. So, he did not argue. He did not raise his voice or point out that he had forgotten more about that building than Brandon Cole would ever learn, or that the floors the man was standing on so proudly were clean because Eddie had knelt on them at 2 a.m. for 20 years. He simply, slowly straightened up from the trash bin. He set down his cleaning cart. He peeled off his work gloves, one and then the other, folded them, and laid them on the cart with a care that somehow made the whole ballroom go quieter than Brandon's microphone ever had. He took one last unhurried look around the building he had kept clean for 2 decades, and he turned toward the door, his back straight and his head up, to walk out of Halverson Reed for the last time, and to carry his 40 names and his one dead son and his whole enormous secret out into the night with him, unthanked, unknown, exactly as he had always intended. There was something about the way he folded those gloves that reached the room more than any speech could have. No drama in it, no martyrdom. Just an old man with enormous dignity, declining to perform the breakdown his tormentor wanted, gathering the small tools of his small job and preparing to leave the way he had done everything for 20 years, quietly and with his back straight. A few people in that ballroom felt the first hot prick of shame, the dawning sense that they had just laughed along with something they were going to be ashamed of later. But shame is slow, and courage is rare, and the moment to speak was already passing, and the comfortable people did what comfortable people do. They let it pass. Eddie walked, past the round tables and the glittering centerpieces, past the faces that would not quite meet his eyes, past the stage where a young man in a beautiful suit watched his prop walk away with the first faint flicker of something. Not yet guilt, just the animal sense that the moment had not landed the way he'd meant it to. Eddie did not hurry, and he did not slow. He carried the green notebook over his heart, 40 names and one dead boy, the whole weight of a secret life, toward the door and the cold beyond it. He was, in that moment, exactly what the world had always insisted he was, a janitor leaving, and also, entirely unknown to every soul in the room, the most extraordinary person any of them would ever stand near. That was the moment that should have been the end of it. A good man walking out a door while a room full of comfortable people studied their wine. It is how these stories usually end in real life, quietly, unjustly, with the cruel man still holding the microphone. And it would have ended that way tonight, too. Except that the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and a man walked in who was not supposed to be there yet. An old man, silver-haired, in a very good and very quiet suit, who had founded this company 40 years before, and still came to the gala every single year. His name was Walter Halverson, and he stopped dead in the doorway, staring at the janitor walking toward him, with the folded gloves and the straight back, because Walter Halverson knew exactly who Eddie Turner was. "Eddie," he said, and then, louder, his voice cutting clean across the music and the murmur, to the whole room. "Stop! Everybody stop! What in God's name is happening in here?" The music cut off mid-song. The room went still. Up on the stage, Brandon recovered fast, sliding into the smooth, warm voice he kept polished for the people who mattered. "Mr. Halvorsen, we were just having a little fun talking through some staffing efficiencies for the new fiscal. You were firing Eddie Turner," Walter said. It was not a question. The old founder walked slowly into the center of the room, and his eyes never once left the janitor, and there was something on his face that none of these young executives had ever seen there before, something close to awe. For a laugh, in front of everyone, he turned, taking in the whole ballroom, all those expensive faces. "Most of you have absolutely no idea who you have been walking past for 20 years. I do. I found out 3 years ago, entirely by accident. And I have kept this man's secret ever since, because he asked me to, and because it was the single most humbling thing I have ever learned about another human being in my life." He looked back at Eddie, and his voice gentled. "But I am not going to stand in this room and watch you get thrown out like trash. Not you. So, with your permission, old friend, I think it is long past time these people learned the truth about the man they have spent the night laughing at." Eddie was quiet for a long moment, and then, because he was tired, finally after 20 years of being invisible, and because Maurice deserved to be spoken out loud at least once before Eddie himself was gone too, he gave the smallest nod. Walter Halverson had carried this secret for 3 years, and the carrying of it had changed him. He had stumbled onto it the way you stumble onto the most important things, sideways, by accident. The daughter of one of his own longtime employees had won a scholarship from a foundation no one in the family could quite identify, and Walter, who had spent 40 years building the company and had reached the age where a man starts wondering what any of it was actually for, had gotten curious. He could not have said exactly why he chased it, only that something about an anonymous hand reaching into his own building to lift up his own people would not let him rest. He set his lawyers on it as a kind of hobby, expecting to find a quiet, wealthy donor, a foundation with a tax motive, the ordinary machinery of philanthropy. What the lawyers found instead, after the better part of a year of pulling threads, was a single modest bank account, fed in cash and money orders, a few dollars at a time, going back 20 years. And at the end of the trail, the name on it had stopped Walter cold in his own office. Edward Turner, night custodian, a man Walter had nodded to in the lobby 1,000 times and never once had a conversation with. Walter had sat with that for a long time. Then he had done the only thing that felt right. He had gone, alone, one night, and found Eddie on his rounds and told him quietly that he knew. And Eddie had asked him, with a dignity that humbled the old founder, to keep it to himself, because the whole point was that nobody know. And Walter had kept that promise for 3 years, and it had quietly reorganized his entire sense of what a successful life even was. So, when he walked into that gala tonight and saw the man being thrown out for sport, there was never any chance he would stay silent. Not about this. Not about him. And so, Walter Halverson turned to a ballroom full of the most important people in the company, and he began to tell them what their janitor had done. "There is a scholarship fund," Walter said, his voice steady and carrying, the voice of a man who had built something once and still knew exactly how to hold a room. A small one. You will not have heard of it. No gala, no donor wall, no name anyone would recognize. For 20 years, it has quietly paid the full tuition of young people who had everything it takes to make something of themselves except the money. Kids who were one bad break from falling straight through the cracks in the floor. 40 of them over the years. 40. Nurses, teachers, engineers, people who are, tonight, doing extraordinary things with lives that very nearly never got started at all. If you have ever been the person nobody in the room bothered to see, stay with me, because what comes next is the entire reason this story exists. Take a second to comment where you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button, and let's finish this together. I found out about it 3 years ago, Walter went on, and only by accident. One of the recipients turned out to be the child of someone who works in this very building, and I got curious about who was being so generous to my own people, and I started asking questions. It took my lawyers the better part of a year, because whoever set this fund up did not want to be found. They had buried themselves under layer after layer of paperwork, behind a foundation with no face on it anywhere. And at the very bottom of all of it, when we finally got there, was a single bank account, funded in cash and in money orders, small deposits, 20 years of them. He paused, and the whole room leaned in toward him. Made by a man earning a custodian's wage. For a second the words did not land. A man earning a custodian's wage, because they did not fit any story the room knew how to tell. Wealthy people fund scholarships. That is the order of things. The idea that the anonymous benefactor everyone in that industry vaguely admired could be the janitor, the actual janitor, the one whose cart was still parked by the wall, scrambled something fundamental in the room's understanding of how the world is arranged. You could see it move through the crowd like a current, confusion, then disbelief, then the slow, horrified arithmetic of it. Every head in that ballroom turned slowly toward the old black man standing by the trash cans with his folded gloves in his hand. "Eddie Turner," Walter Halverson said, "has given away the better part of his entire life's wages in secret for 2 decades to put other people's children through college. He has lived in one rented room and eaten one restaurant meal a month so that strangers' kids could have the future he believed every child on God's earth deserves. He has never once asked for $1 of credit. He has never let a single one of them learn his name. The old founder's voice cracked, just slightly. And tonight, you laughed at him. You called him a lesson in failure. You tried to throw him out the door as the entertainment for your party. The silence in that room was a physical thing. You could have heard a pin drop into a snowbank a mile away. And then Walter did the thing that split the whole night wide open. "If you are in this room tonight," he said, "and once, somewhere along the way, an envelope changed the entire course of your life, a scholarship you could never quite explain, from a foundation you could never quite track down, then I would like you to stand up, right now. I think it is long past time that all of you met the man you have been looking for." For one long heartbeat, nothing happened at all. Then, at a table near the front, a young woman in a green dress stood up, and she was already crying before she was fully on her feet. Her name was Danielle, and she ran the pediatric intensive care unit at the city hospital now. And 11 years ago, she had been a teenager with a father in prison and a mother working nights and a nursing school acceptance she had no earthly way to pay for. An envelope had arrived in the exact week she had decided to give the whole dream up and take a job at the mall instead. She had wondered every single day of the career that envelope gave her who had sent it. She had promised herself that if she ever found out, she would tell them what they had done for her. And now she knew, and she was looking straight at him, and she could not force a single word past the crying. Then the man in his 30s, 2 tables over, stood, Marcus, who had a software company and 40 employees of his own now. And his jaw was working because he too had spent a decade wondering, and the answer had been an old man he had handed his trash to 100 times without once looking at his face. Then a woman at a far table who taught 3rd grade in the very neighborhood Eddie had grown up hungry in. Then 2 brothers, side by side, who had built a garage out of the start their schooling had given them. Then a city councilwoman who simply put her hand over her mouth and rose. Then more, and then more. Not all 40 of them were in that room, but enough of them were, scattered all through the crowd in their good clothes, that the standing became a wave, a slow rising tide of people getting to their feet all across that ballroom, each one of them a life, each one of them a door Eddie Turner had pried open with a janitor's wage and a broken father's heart. Each one of them, too, carried a piece of the same impossible story, and you could see it move across their faces as they stood. The slow dawning that the envelope they had spent years being grateful to no one for had come from this man. The teacher had grown up 3 blocks from where Eddie grew up. She taught now in the same elementary school that had once held a coat drive Eddie still remembered being on the wrong end of. And she had no idea that the quiet old janitor and the anonymous foundation that saved her were the same soul. One of the brothers was openly weeping into his sleeve. The other had his arm around him and was staring at Eddie like a man looking at something holy. A nurse near the bar had her hand pressed flat over her badge, as if to keep her own heart in her chest. A young software engineer kept starting to sit back down and then standing again, undone, unable to settle, because the architecture of his entire adult life had just been revealed to rest on a foundation he'd never known was there. And the ones who were not standing, the executives and the board members and the comfortable people who had laughed at the old man 10 minutes before, looked around at the rising tide of the saved and did the arithmetic. And the arithmetic broke something open in them, because it was no longer abstract. It was no longer a number in a speech. It was a room full of actual, breathing, accomplished human beings, on their feet, in tears, turned toward a man with a mop and a worn green notebook, and the truth of what he was could not be unseen now, or explained away, or laughed off. The most important person in the building had been emptying their trash for 20 years, and they had handed him their garbage without once learning his name, and now they had to live inside that knowledge for the rest of their lives. The people still seated looked around at the ones standing, and you could watch them doing the impossible arithmetic of it, that the old man emptying the trash, the one their own vice president had just called a lesson in failure, had quietly and visibly, over 20 years, built a meaningful share of all the success in that room. Doctors, engineers, teachers, founders, an entire constellation of accomplished lives, and at the dark center of it, the gravity holding all of it together, a man not one of them had ever thought to look at twice. And then, slowly, at the very center of it all, the man on the stage went white. Because Brandon Cole was doing the math he had spent 15 years refusing to do. The envelope, at 18. The grades and not a dime, the road forking toward the bad place, and then the scholarship that came out of nowhere, anonymous, no name, nobody to thank, the thing he had told himself didn't matter, that he had earned, that proved he was self-made. He looked at the people standing all around the room, the green dress, the software founder, the teacher, the strangers all turned toward an old janitor, and he understood, with a horror that opened up under him like a trap door, that he was one of them, that the door he had walked through, the single door that had made everything he now was, had been held open for him by the old black man he had just tried to fire for sport, in front of everyone, as a lesson in failure. The microphone was still in Brandon's hand. He did not say anything into it. There was nothing to say. The smooth, untouchable vice president stood on that stage and came apart in total silence, the whole architecture of his self-made story collapsing in real time because the man he had built his pride on top of had just turned out to be the man he had spent the entire night grinding under his heel. It was Eddie who finally moved. He walked, unhurried, with the quiet dignity of a man who has nothing left to prove to anyone, to the front of the room, and the standing graduates parted to let him through, and some of them reached out just to touch his sleeve as he passed, as though to be sure that he was real. He took the small green notebook out of his shirt pocket, and he opened it, and he spoke for the first time all night, in a low voice that the silent room strained forward to catch. 40 names in this book, Eddie said. 20 years. I wrote down every one of you. Not so you would ever know me. I never wanted that. Just so I would remember that the doors got opened, that it worked, that it was real. He looked up, and his dark eyes were wet. But there is one name at the front of this book that doesn't have a happy note written next to it. The first name. The one that all the rest of you are really for. He turned to the very first page, and he held it open. And though no one in the back of the room could read the writing, every soul in that ballroom understood when his voice broke on it. My son. Maurice. He had to stop and breathe. He had the grades. He didn't have the money, and the door that opened for every single one of you standing up tonight. It closed in his face, and I lost my boy for the want of a few $1,000s that nobody would lend us. Eddie pressed the notebook flat against his chest, over his heart. I couldn't save my son. That door is shut forever. So I spent the rest of my life holding it open for everybody else's child, so that no other father would ever have to bury what I buried. That's all this ever was. That is the whole secret. A man who couldn't save his own boy, trying to make sure that nobody else's boy ever drowned the same way. For a moment, nobody in that ballroom breathed. The thing about a room full of comfortable, successful people is that almost every one of them has, somewhere far back, a fork they barely got through, a teacher who stayed late, a loan that came through, a parent who worked a third job, some hand that held a door at the right moment, and Eddie's words found that buried place in every single one of them at once. The councilwoman was weeping without bothering to wipe her face. A senior partner who had not cried since his own father's funeral pressed his lips together and lost the fight. Even the waiters had stopped moving. It was the particular silence of a room full of people each privately doing the math of their own life and arriving all at the same time at the same humbling answer. None of us did it alone. We only thought we did. And the green notebook, held open in an old man's calloused hands, had stopped being a janitor's curiosity and become the most important object in the building, a ledger not of money but of mercy, 40 lives deep, with a dead boy's name at the top holding up all the rest. Some of the graduates had their hands pressed over their mouths. Danielle had sunk back into her chair as though her legs had given out. The young woman from accounting, who still did not know that the anonymous gift cards on her keyboard had come from the same man, was crying for reasons she could not yet fully name, only that she had been right hours ago to want to stand up and say, "Stop," and she understood now exactly what and exactly who she had almost failed to defend. Brandon Cole came down off the stage. He came down slowly, like a man walking to the edge of something, and he crossed the silent room to where Eddie stood. And the ruthless young vice president, who had never once apologized for anything in his entire climb out of nothing, stood in front of the old janitor and could barely force the words up out of his throat. "It was you," he said. "My scholarship. When I was 18, the envelope. It was you." His voice cracked straight down the middle. "I had nowhere to go. I would have ended up exactly where I said you end up, tonight, when I pointed at you. And it was you who—" He could not finish it. The entire self-made story of Brandon Cole, the pride he had worn like armor, the contempt he had aimed at every struggling person beneath him just to prove how far he had come, all of it had been standing, the whole time, on a foundation poured in secret by the man he had just tried to throw in the trash. Eddie looked at him for a long moment. And here is the thing about Eddie Turner, the thing that made him who he was. He did not have it in him to crush even the man who had humiliated him, because Eddie did not see a cruel executive standing in front of him. He saw a frightened poor kid from a hard town who had gotten exactly one envelope and clawed his way out, and had been so terrified of falling back that he had turned hard and mean against everyone who reminded him of where he'd started. Eddie had been holding doors open for kids exactly like Brandon his entire life. Brandon had simply grown up and forgotten that he had ever walked through one. "I know who you were at 18, Eddie said quietly. "I picked you out of a stack of applications myself. You want to know why?" Brandon could barely nod. "Because you reminded me of my Maurice." Brandon flinched as though he had been struck. "I didn't hold that door open for you so you could grow up and slam it on the next kid. The question now isn't whether you're sorry, son. I can see that you are. The question is what you do with the second life that somebody handed you for free. I already know you can climb. Anybody can climb if they're hungry and scared enough. Let's see if you can turn around and pull somebody up behind you. That is the only thing that was ever going to make that envelope worth the price I paid for it." It was the most devastating thing anyone could have said to Brandon Cole, and the kindest, and it was both at the very same time, and every person in that room knew they had just watched a man be handed back his own soul, and told gently to do better with it. Brandon did not say anything. There was nothing left in him to say it with. He had walked into that ballroom a few hours ago as the youngest vice president in the company's history, armored in a story about a self-made man who owed the world nothing, and he was standing now in front of 400 people inside the wreckage of that story, looking at the old black man whose secret generosity was the actual foundation of everything Brandon had ever called his own. The cruelty he had aimed at the strugglers, the contempt, the holiday bonuses he had cut, the names he'd never learned, all of it had been, he understood now, a war against his own beginnings, fought on the bodies of people exactly like the man who had saved him. It was the kind of thing that does not let a person stay the same. He covered his face with one hand, the gesture of a man who has run out of armor, and for the first time since he was 18 years old, and crying over an envelope at a kitchen table, Brandon Cole wept in front of other people. Nobody mocked him for it. That was the strange grace of the room in that moment. The same room that had laughed at an old janitor an hour before, now watched a powerful man fall apart and felt no triumph in it. Only the heavy, clarifying weight of a truth that had rearranged all of them at once. Eddie reached out and put one calloused hand on Brandon's shoulder, the same hand that had emptied his trash 100 times, and he did not say it's okay, because it was not okay, and Eddie did not lie. He just left the hand there, steady, the way you steady a man at the edge of something, and let the younger one feel that even now, even here, the door was not being slammed on him either. The applause did not start politely. It started somewhere in the back, and it came up like a wave breaking, and the whole ballroom was on its feet. Not for Brandon, not even for Walter, but for the old man with the green notebook who had been invisible among them for 20 years. The graduates reached him first, the green dress and the software founder and the teacher and all the others. And they did not shake his hand. They put their arms around him, this stranger who was the most important person that none of them had ever met. And Eddie Turner, who had asked for nothing and been given nothing and given everything, stood in the middle of all the lives that he had saved, and for the first time in 2 decades, he let himself be held. They came to him one at a time, and each one was a small, unbearable miracle. It was Danielle who finally got the words out first. She held Eddie at arm's length, her makeup ruined, and she said, "I tried for 11 years to find out who sent that envelope. I needed to tell them that I almost quit. The week it came, I had already filled out the application for the job at the mall. I had given up. And then it was just there, in my mailbox, with no name on it." She was shaking. "You gave me my entire life, and I handed you my coffee cup in the elevator last spring and didn't even look at your face." And Eddie, who had spent 20 years making certain that no one ever felt they owed him a thing, did the only thing he knew how to do. He told her she owed him nothing, that the only payment he had ever wanted was the life she had built, and that an ICU full of children she had kept alive was worth more than any thank you she could ever say. "You already paid me back," he told her. "You paid me back and every kid you ever kept breathing. That was always the whole deal." The software founder, Marcus, came next, and he could barely speak. "I name a scholarship every year at my company," he said, "for kids who can't afford it. I tell people I do it because somebody once did it for me, and I always felt like a fraud saying it, because I didn't actually know if anybody had. I thought maybe I just got lucky." He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. "It was you. The whole time, the reason I give was you, and I never even knew your name to thank you." Eddie just put a hand on the younger man's shoulder and said, "Then you've been paying me forward for years without knowing it. That's the best a man could ask. Keep doing it. That's all I ever wanted, that it keeps going." The teacher told him about the children she taught now, in the old neighborhood, and how she'd kept the anonymous envelope all these years in a frame on her classroom wall, with a note under it that read, "Someone believed in me, so I believe in you." She had been telling Eddie's story to children for a decade without knowing it was his. The 2 brothers told him about the garage, about the families they employed now, men who would have had nowhere else to go. The councilwoman told him about the housing bill she'd passed, and how it existed because a girl who should have been a statistic got a degree instead. Each of them a door, each of them a fork in the road where Maurice's ghost had stood, and where, because of Eddie, a different child had been allowed to go the other way. And as they talked, the rest of the room listened, and the listening changed them, because it is one thing to be told that a man gave away his wages, and another thing entirely to stand in a room and watch the actual human beings he saved come forward, one after another, and weep and try to find words for a debt that has no words. The gala had stopped being a gala. The catering went cold. The band did not play. 400 people who had come for an anniversary party stood instead in the middle of something none of them would ever forget. Watching a truth they could not unknow rearrange everything they had believed about who, in a building, actually matters. Brandon Cole did not stay for it. He couldn't. He slipped out a side door somewhere in the middle of the graduate's testimony because there is only so much truth a man can stand inside of at once, and he had a very great deal of it to sit alone with that night. Nobody stopped him. Nobody needed to. The party was not ending so much as transforming, and the man at the center of the cruelty had simply ceased to be the center of anything at all. Walter Halverson stood off to one side and watched the old janitor be surrounded by the lives he had saved, and the old founder, who had built a company worth more than he could ever spend, and had believed, until 3 years ago, that he understood what generosity was, wept quietly into his handkerchief. Because he understood now that he had never once in his long life given anything the way this man on his payroll had given everything, year after year, for nothing, for strangers, in the dark. It was nearly midnight before the room finally thinned. And when Eddie at last made his way toward the door, the same door he had been walking toward when all of this began, the walk was a different walk. This time, the people he passed knew his name, and said it, and some of them could not meet his eyes for the shame of all the years they hadn't. This time, he did not leave invisible. He left, for the first time in 20 years, seen, carrying the same green notebook in the same shirt pocket, the same 40 names, the same one name at the top of the list, out into the same cold night. But the night was not as dark as it had been. The young woman from accounting caught him near the doors. She was the one who had almost stood up at the start and hadn't, the one who'd found the gift cards on her keyboard and never known. She didn't know the cards were his. She would only piece that together later, alone, and it would undo her. But she knew enough now to stop the old man and take his hand in both of hers and say simply, "Thank you for what you are. I'm sorry it took us so long to look." Eddie patted her hand the way a grandfather would and told her to get home safe. And that was all, and it was everything. And Walter Halverson walked him out, the founder of the company personally walking the night custodian to the door, a sight that said more about what had happened that night than any speech could have. At the threshold, the two old men stood for a moment in the cold air. 20 years, Eddie," Walter said quietly. 20 years I ran this place, and I never knew the best man in the building was the one emptying the bins." Eddie just shrugged, the small shrug of a man genuinely without vanity, and said, "Best and worst of us are mostly the people nobody's looking at, Mr. Halverson. That's all. You just gotta look." And then he went home to his single rented room, and his hot plate, and his shelf of library books, the same as every other night of 20 years. Except that tomorrow, everything would be different. What happened after that night happened quickly, the way things do, once the truth is finally out in the open. By Monday morning, the whole company knew. There had been 400 witnesses and 100 phones, and the story moved through the building floor by floor. The janitor, the 40 names, the vice president who'd been one of them, the green notebook. People who had handed Eddie their trash for years came down to the lobby just to shake his hand, awkward and ashamed and sincere, and Eddie received every one of them with the same gentle patience, never once making any of them feel the weight of all the years they hadn't looked. The young woman from accounting cried at her desk when she finally connected the anonymous deli cards to the old man, and then she went and found him and could not even speak, and Eddie just nodded because he understood and squeezed her hand and told her to eat a real lunch today. Something shifted in that building that week, something that went well beyond one man. You cannot watch what that room watched and go back to treating the people at the edges as furniture. The spell of invisibility, once broken, does not easily reform. Staff who had been background for years suddenly had names attached to them in people's minds. It did not turn the company into a utopia. Nothing does that. But it cracked something open, and through the crack came a little more light than there had been before. That is usually how it goes, not a revolution, a crack and a little more light. Walter Halverson did not let the moment dissolve into a feel-good story that people told at parties and then forgot. He took Eddie's small, stubborn, hand-built fund, and he put the full weight of the company behind it. The Morris Turner Scholarship, named at last, out loud, for the boy whose closed door had opened 40 others, became real and permanent and large, with an endowment that would outlive every single person who had stood in that ballroom. Eddie was made its director. He was given an office and a salary that, after a lifetime on a custodian's wage, he honestly did not know what to do with. He kept the green notebook on the new desk. He kept adding names to it. The list grew a great deal longer than 40. The first thing Eddie did with a real budget was the thing he had ached to do for 20 years and never been able to. He stopped having to choose. For 2 decades, every name in that notebook had been a small, private agony of selection, because a janitor can only save so many, which meant that for every kid he pulled out of the dark, there were others he'd had to watch go under, because the math would simply not stretch any further. He had carried those ones too, the ones he couldn't save, a second secret list, the one he never wrote down, the faces of the kids he had had to walk past because the money was already spoken for. Now the math stretched. Now, when Eddie found a bright kid standing at the fork in the road, he did not have to decide whether he could afford to hold the door. He just held it. The list passed 60 names before the first year was out, and the second secret list, the one of the ones he'd lost, finally stopped getting longer. He insisted on a few unbreakable rules for the fund, and Walter's lawyers wrote them into its bones so no future board could ever vote them away. The scholarships would stay anonymous to the recipient, always, because Eddie believed to his core that the cleanest gift is the one that leaves no debt. The fund would go looking for its kids in the places the world looked last: the shelters, the night shifts, the mail rooms, the bus stops, instead of waiting for the polished applicants to come to it. And no child would ever be turned down over a sum of money that the people in that ballroom spent on a single dinner. He had buried a boy over exactly that sum. He was not going to let the thing built in that boy's name ever do the same. And once a month, Eddie drove out to the cemetery, and he sat with Maurice, and he told his son the new names. He'd lower himself down onto the grass by the stone, his knees not what they used to be, and he'd take out the green notebook, and he'd read. "Got 3 this month, baby," he'd say. "Girl named Keisha, wants to be a doctor. Reminded me of you, that smile, the way she ducks her head when she's pleased about something. Boy named Andre, real quiet, sharp as anything. And a little one, Maria, first in her family to even finish high school." For 20 years, he had brought that stone nothing but apologies. "I'm sorry, son. I'm so sorry. If I'd only had the money, if I'd only been home more." Now, at last, he had something else to bring. Not an apology, a report. 40 doors, then 60, then 100. A whole army of saved children marching out into their lives, every single one of them carrying, without ever knowing it, a piece of a boy named Maurice Turner who had never been given the chance to grow up. It did not bring his son back. Nothing in this world was ever going to bring his son back, but it had taken the worst thing that ever happened to a human being and turned it, slowly, into the best thing he ever did. And there is a kind of peace in that. The hard-won kind, the only kind that is ever real. As for Brandon Cole did the work. To everyone's surprise, including his own, he did the work. He could have let that night break him into something bitter and small, and a lesser man would have. Instead, he showed up at Eddie's new office a week later, and he did not make a speech because he had finally learned that speeches were the cheapest thing he owned. He just asked quietly what he could do, and then he did it, for once in his life, with no audience to perform for. He poured the same ferocious drive he had spent years using to climb over people into the fund, instead, into hunting down the next kid at the next fork, one bad break from the bad road. He turned out to be formidable at it, because the same sharp eye that had made him a brutal executive made him uncanny at spotting potential in the exact places the world had taught itself not to look. The first scholarship Brandon personally funded went to a boy from his own old hometown, the poor town he had spent his entire adult life pretending he was not from. He drove the 3 hours out there himself, and he found the kid, and he handed him the envelope in person. And then he did the hardest and bravest thing Brandon Cole had ever done. He told the boy where he was from. He said, "I grew up 4 streets from here, same school, same nothing. Somebody I never met held a door open for me once, and I spent 15 years being ashamed of needing it and being cruel to people who reminded me of it. Don't you do that. You take this, and you don't carry 1 ounce of shame about it, and someday you hold the door for the next one. It did not make Brandon a good man overnight. It made him a better one, slowly, which is the only way anyone ever actually becomes good. And it started, as these things so often do, with a man finally turning around to look at the place he had come from, instead of running from it for the rest of his life. The change held, which is the rarest part of any redemption. It would have been easy for Brandon to make one grand gesture, feel cleansed, and slide back into the man he'd been. Eddie watched for exactly that, the way you watch a patient you're not sure will take the medicine. But it didn't happen. Brandon started learning the names of the people on the floors below him. He started saying good morning to the security guard he'd ignored for 2 years, and then started actually stopping to talk. He reversed the bonus cuts he'd been so proud of. People who had spent years flinching when he walked in slowly stopped flinching. It was not dramatic, and there were no cameras for it, and that was precisely how Eddie knew it was real, because the truest changes, like the truest gifts, are the ones nobody is applauding. A few years on, when Eddie's knees finally made the late nights too much and he stepped back from running the fun day to day, it was Brandon he trusted to carry it. The man who had once pointed at an old janitor and called him a lesson in failure spent his evenings now reading scholarship applications, hunting for the kid at the fork in the road, holding the door. Eddie had been right about him at 18 and right about him again at 34. Under all that fear, there had always been someone worth saving. It just took the worst night of Brandon's life and the quiet mercy of the man he'd wronged to finally let that someone out. He kept the diner breakfast, though, first Sunday of every month, same booth, same waitress, same eggs. Except now sometimes he brought a guest, a nervous new recipient who had no idea why the quiet old man from the foundation wanted to buy them breakfast. And Eddie would tell them, over the eggs, the only piece of advice he ever gave any of them. Somebody held a door open for you, he'd say. You don't owe me a thing for it, but someday, when you can, you find a door and you hold it for somebody else. That's the whole arrangement. That is how you pay me back. And then he'd let them eat and watch them. And somewhere underneath it, he would be thinking of a boy who never got his breakfast, his college, his chance. There was one in particular, a girl named Keisha, 17, who reminded him so much of who Maurice might have been that he had to look out the window for a moment when she first slid into the booth. She had the grades and the hunger and not $1 and a mother working 2 jobs, and that wary, armored politeness that bright poor kids learn early as protection. She kept asking what the catch was. She had never in her life been handed something with no catch, and she did not trust it. And Eddie did not blame her one bit. So he didn't argue with her. He just bought her the biggest breakfast on the menu and let her eat it, and told her about the ocean of doors in the world and how every single one of them could be opened by a few people deciding a kid was worth it. Halfway through the eggs, she stopped being suspicious and started, just barely, to let herself hope. And Eddie watched it happen across the table, watched a guarded child allow, for the first time, the dangerous possibility that her life might actually go somewhere. And it was, he thought, the closest thing to seeing Maurice again that this world was ever going to give him. He told Rosa, the waitress, to bring the girl a slice of pie, too. And Keisha protested, and Eddie said the thing he always said, let people be good to you when they want to. It's the only way the world works at all. She is in her 2nd year of pre-med now. She still doesn't fully know what the old man did, but she pays for the occasional stranger's coffee when she can, and she could not tell you why, except that someone once bought her pie she didn't ask for, and it changed something. A year later, at the next gala, there was no janitor at the back of the room being laughed at. Eddie Turner sat at the head table, in a suit the fund's graduates had chipped in to buy him, and the company had quietly retired the old custom of treating its support staff like part of the furniture. There were new policies now, written after that night, with Eddie's fingerprints all over them, And the people who emptied the bins and ran the mail and guarded the doors got named and thanked and paid like the human beings they had always been. It was not a revolution, but it was a building that had learned, the hard way, to look at the people it had spent decades looking through. And that is its own quiet kind of justice, the kind that does not make the news and changes everything. And one by one, that night, the people Eddie had put through school stood up, not because anyone called for it this time, but because they simply could not help themselves, and told the room what an envelope had done for their one and only life. Danielle spoke about the children she'd kept alive in the ICU and said that every one of them was, in a way, Eddie's. The teacher read aloud the note she kept framed on her classroom wall. The councilwoman talked about a girl who should have been a statistic and became a lawmaker instead. The boy from Brandon's hometown, in his first year of college now, stood up shaking and said he hadn't fully understood, that night, how many hands had held that door, but he knew enough to be standing there, and he was going to spend his life holding it for the next one. The nurse who ran the ICU, the teacher, the councilwoman, the boy from Brandon's hometown. 40 lives, then 60, then more. A whole constellation of them, every single one existing, because a grieving father had refused to let his son's closed door be the end of the story. And at the head table sat the old man who had done it all from behind a mop, in the dark, for nothing. For 20 years, seen at last and surrounded at last by a family of strangers, he had built one envelope at a time, all of them gathered, without quite knowing it, around the memory of a boy named Maurice. So, let me ask you something before you go. There is a person you walk past. You walk past them all the time. The one cleaning the office after you have gone home for the night. The one emptying the bins. The one whose name tag you have never once read. Whose whole life you have quietly decided cannot amount to very much. We are all so certain we know who matters in a room. We are so sure the important people are the loud ones, the ones at the microphone, the ones in the good suits with the good titles. And we are so often so completely and so catastrophically wrong because you have no idea what the quiet person at the edge of the room is carrying. You have no idea what they have survived or what they have given away, or whose entire life they have saved without ever being thanked or ever asking to be. The most generous person you will ever stand next to is almost never the one announcing it. Far more often it is the one nobody is looking at, the one who took the worst thing that ever happened to them and turned it, in silence, into a door they hold open for strangers, for 20 years, expecting nothing in return but the quiet knowledge that it worked. And think about how close it came to staying buried. If Walter Halverson had not walked through that door at that exact minute, Eddie Turner would have left that building and taken his 40 names into the night, and not one person in that room would ever have known. He'd have gone right on giving in secret until the day he died, and the people he saved would have gone right on believing they did it alone, and the man who laughed at him would have gone right on laughing. That is the part that should keep you up tonight. Not that the truth came out, but how very nearly it didn't. For every Eddie Turner who gets found out, there are 100 who never do. They are out there right now, the quiet ones, holding doors open in the dark that you will never hear about. You have almost certainly walked past one this week. So, here is what I want from you tonight. The next time you are about to walk past someone the world has decided is nobody, the janitor, the cleaner, the old man with the mop and the worn-out notebook, stop, learn their name, look them in the eye, because you cannot possibly know whose envelope they once were, whose door they have been holding open in the dark, or whose son they are still, somehow, trying to save through you. And one day, like Brandon Cole, you may find out that you owe your entire life to the very person you almost didn't see. And here is the harder thing. The thing Eddie's life really asks of you. It is easy to be moved by this story tonight, sitting where you are, and to feel that warm ache and then go to sleep and wake up tomorrow and walk past the cleaner in your own building exactly the way you always have. The story does not want your tears. Eddie would have had no use at all for your tears. What his life asks is smaller and much harder, that tomorrow you actually look, that you learn one name you've never bothered to learn, that you find one door for one kid, one struggling person, one human being the world has written off, and you hold it open quietly, expecting nothing, the way it was once held open for you, because it was held open for you, whether you remember the hand or not. None of us got here alone, not one of us. We only tell ourselves we did. Be the kind of person who holds the door before they know who's walking through it. That is the whole of it. That is the only thing Eddie Turner ever did, 40 times over, in the dark, for nothing. And it turned out to be enough to fill a ballroom with the lives it saved. If Eddie's story moved you, tell me in the comments about someone who quietly held a door open for you when you had nothing. And then go and say their name to them, out loud, while you still can. Hit that like button so more people find this story, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. Because the title, the suit, the microphone, none of it was ever the measure of a person. The measure is how many doors you held open when nobody was watching, and nobody would ever know that it was you. Take care of each other, hold the door open, and I'll see you in the next story.